Spider-Man is a character that needs no introduction. Everyone knows who he is, whether you're a diehard fan, just your average moviegoer, or even someone who doesn't even watch movies but sees him in memes. You know who he is. Following the release of the highly anticipated No Way Home, there are now 9 Spider-Man movies, and today we'll be ranking them. Of those 9, they are only solo Spider-Man movies, not appearances in other properties like Captain America Civil War, etc. And when we do talk about No Way Home, I will not include any spoilers. So without further ado, let's get into it. Spider-Man 3 is commonly known as Sam Raimi's worst Spider-Man film, and as you can see in this video and a lot of other people's videos, it is the worst Spider-Man full stop. However, it isn't awful. Yes, it is seriously flawed given its rating and position, but overall it does still feel like a continuation of Raimi's films, but it just has too much studio interference which lets it down in certain occasions. In all Raimi's films, there's always a certain sense of exaggeration from mainly the extras, but it always matched the tone, whereas here it just stood out like a sore thumb, and that's personified with Emo Peter. Now, I mentioned studio interference with this film, and the main sign of that is the introduction of the character Venom, or Eddie Brock. He wasn't intended to be in this film, and as it's shown, he is not well executed as he's amongst too many other villains. Topher Grace himself is actually fine as Eddie Brock. He's not abysmal, but he's not that great as Venom, and overall he'd be quite a forgettable villain if this wasn't such an infamous film. Having a symbiote alien involved just didn't match the same tone as all his other grounded films. Sandman, on the other hand, was quite good in my opinion. I would say he gets more hate than he deserves, but to be honest, he doesn't get any hate. He doesn't really get any love either. He's kind of not talked about at all, but maybe if he was given more development, he would be up there with some of the best, but I thought he was a bright light in quite a dark film. Besides a lot of silliness, this film also just contains too many plot lines amongst, and it all ends up tying off Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy in quite an unsatisfying way. This film is frustrating because it really doesn't handle its characters well. As I mentioned, Sandman could have done with more development. There's more potential there. Although it's intentional, Peter is so oblivious to the things beyond belief where it just becomes irritating, and his selfishness, rightly so, should annoy MJ, but just the way she reacts is also just kind of annoying. They attempted something in making Harry evil in this film, but then immediately strip him of that with giving him amnesia, which then comes into play towards the end. So I just felt that was kind of pointless and sidelined him for a bit because they didn't know how to juggle all the villains. As I mentioned, Emo Peter and his dance sequence is probably the standout thing from this film in terms of status, not as in quality. It's certainly a low point for this character in any sort of media, as well as other things in this movie. While this has always been deemed a dreadful film, watching it many years later, following on from the rise of social media, this film will actually be a fun watch for many, and me included. Obviously, it's not great. It doesn't have as good of a rating as all the other films on this list, but it is enjoyable thanks to how social media and memes have turned elements of this film into. So it was trying to do something different but end up being unintentionally funny, and they were kind of the most enjoyable parts about watching this flawed film. Funny enough, this is the first Spider-Man film I actually saw in cinema, and I enjoyed it back then, but as time went on I rewatched it, I realised it wasn't actually that good. But now it had been about 4 years since I last saw it, and rewatching it recently, I never realised how frustrating it is. Frustrating not in terms of how bad things are, but how balanced it is with the good and the bad. I'll talk about the positives first. I think anyone will tell you about this film is the relationship between Peter and Gwen, Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone. Obviously at this time they were a couple, but they just have excellent chemistry, and Mark Webb knew what he was doing with these scenes designed with them two in it, because that was the strongest part of this film, and that's really saying something in a Spider-Man film. I know people criticize the inclusion of the mystery of Peter's parents and trying to force something which maybe isn't there in other films, but I genuinely was curious about it, and although I wouldn't go back in time and stop Tom Holland making his Spider-Man films just so I could see Amazing SpiderMan 3, I was kind of annoyed that I couldn't find out the full mystery behind that. But where this film really does fail to deliver is somewhere where I didn't initially realize when watching due to my age and lack of knowledge, but it's the villains. You know, as a youngster I saw the Rhino and I thought, you know, he's funny, he's goofy, but watching it now it just doesn't match the tone. The whole Harry Osborn thing could have been something good if it hadn't been executed within like 40 minutes. They could have started setting it up from the first movie and Electro. This was the thing which I never realized how bad it was. He is ridiculously cheesy and goofy. Even when he doesn't gain his powers when he's Max Dillon, he's so over the top, and it just doesn't match this film, which is dealing with some of the most serious and mature themes in a Spider-Man movie. I found the tone horribly inconsistent and awfully balanced. So when there were some emotional moments, they really did hit hard, like the clock tower sequence, everything else with the villains. Even though there was some great visuals, especially in the fight scenes, I was just taken out of it because of the silliness of the villains. This could have been in last place if it wasn't for such strong chemistry between Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone, which definitely gave this most of its points. As you can see with the ratings, there is a big jump in quality between this film and the last. And to be honest, the same positives go for this film. However, I think they were actually more impactful in Amazing Spider-Man 2. However, the Amazing Spider-Man does plant those seeds and gradually builds up their relationship in this film, which is just, once again, the strong part of it. Another thing which Mark Webb's Spider-Man films get heavily praised for is their visuals and cinematography. That is one of the reasons I was excited to rewatch these films in time for this video, and I can completely understand why. They are absolutely stunning, and at points more so than Tobey's movies, you really do feel like you're in the point of view of Spider-Man. This film deals with a similar origin story in Raimi's films, obviously as the same character, but this compared to then just isn't the same. It glosses over this process of Uncle Ben's death and him becoming Spider-Man, you know, making his suit and everything. It goes over it too quickly to have a huge impact like the Raimi Spider-Man did. You know, as the story went on, things started to get revealed, and I was like, okay, we're leading to something, and then bam, we were straight into the final act, and I was like, wait, is that the only build-up we're getting? I thought they'd touch upon certain things more. A natural improvement over Raimi's films is the CGI, and as I mentioned, it allows for shots that weren't possible back then, or if they were going to be awful. Mark Webb's first Spider-Man film did have a lot of great things and improvements over Raimi's films, but overall, the main plot line got a bit too far-fetched with the Lizard's motives, and his final plan just felt way too silly. However, I really do enjoy this film, and it's finally getting the recognition it deserves. As time goes on, I actually begin to like Far From Home a little bit less. Now, it's still a solid Spider-Man film, as you can see by my rating, but it does have some issues, but I'll talk about the positives first. This film carries over the positives from the predecessor, that is Tom Holland's naive yet energetic performance, his great chemistry with Ned as well as other classmates, and just in general, that school dynamic, which we haven't really had too much of in previous movies. And with Peter and his class traveling to Europe, it was cool to see Spider-Man at some famous landmarks. Ever since I was a child, I've known about Mysterio and always thought he seemed a bit silly, or if they were to ever bring him into a movie, it would be quite difficult to do. However, I think this film makes the necessary changes to compensate for that. When he does arrive, he is one of the strongest Spider-Man has ever faced in terms of execution and performance, thanks to Jake Gyllenhaal. This follows on from Avengers Endgame, and it doesn't ignore the fact, but because that was such a big film, it's heavily involved with the plot. A lot of people criticize that MCU Spider-Man movies rely too heavily on other things from the MCU, but I mean, you're gonna get these sort of things, what do you expect? And they don't bother me too much because that seems natural. What doesn't seem natural, however, is Tony trusting his multi-million-dollar tech in the hands of a noticeably naive teenager who makes horrible wrong decisions, which has access to drone strikes and satellites. Obviously, the film needs this for the story to play out, and I didn't pick up on it too much on the first watch, but as time goes on, this is the thing that annoys me. However, I still really do enjoy this film as has some quality things, and its post-credit scene really does set up things for No Way Home and brings the character into uncharted territory. This is where things get tricky because growing up, Spider-Man was such an influential film. It was probably my favourite film of all time when I was younger. This film came out the year I was born, so you could essentially say I grew up with it, and I still love it to this day. Now, on rewatch for the first time in many years, there are certain aspects which don't hold up or aren't as good as I remember. It's a bit more campy than I remember, but that just adds to the charm now. That obviously does take away a bit of the rating because there were points where I was like, oh, that's not that's not great. But overall, it works well enough with the tone and adds to the charm. What this film does best that the other ones haven't is the actual origin of Peter Parker, and he's formed in such a natural way that always made me want to go through the process of becoming a superhero when I was younger. Tobey Maguire feels perfect for this role. He has this loser turned hero vibe, and even when he is a hero, he does still come across as a bit of a loser at times. And as great as he is, the stand-up for me is Willem Dafoe, who's so committed to every role he plays. He really buys into the cheesiness of certain things. If he didn't give it his all, it would come across too campy. as he gives it his all. It's hard not to enjoy, and it tops off a film filled with nostalgia, which may not hold up as well as remembered. SpiderMan Homecoming is an unfamiliar telling of Peter Parker, and to be honest, it's not even an origin story despite it being his first movie in the MCU. It picks up right after the events of Captain America Civil War and doesn't really allude to what happened before then. And to be honest, that is kind of a good thing, as it doesn't hold back in needing to devote time to this origin or exposition. It just delivers a very good flowing movie which tackles a new perspective of him juggling his responsibilities with school, and to be honest, I think this is the best depiction of Peter Parker in school, as it's literally in the title, but the way everyone begins to notice how he disappears so much. And also a fresh new addition is Ned, who I just absolutely love, as many do. Michael Keaton returns to the superhero genre, this time with Marvel, and this time as a villain, and on both occasions he's crushed it. Dare I say, more so on this occasion. Vulture for me is probably top 3 Spider-Man villains of all time, and maybe even top 3 MCU villains of all time. This film tackles the high school drama, action, and even comedy. It's one of the funniest ones on this entire list, if not the funniest. So it's a whole lot of fun, and not to mention, as a reboot, it tries something new. You know, it's a tough ranking when a film of this quality only comes in at 3rd place. Spider-Man's story's been told many times in the forms of movies, comics, or even just amongst people. Everyone knows what happens, the same process. Coming into this, people thought, why would an animated film do anything different? Well, this is such a special film, not only for its animation, but also the story it does tell. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse manages to create such a unique environment and draw in all its characters who have their own unique perks or designs, and it just works, and everything about this film is extremely stylish. Not only does it take a new approach with having Miles Morales as our main lead and our main Spider-Man, but it's just so more attractive with this animation style, as it really does feel like a comic book brought to life, and as if every scene is you turning a page of that comic book. As directly quoted in the film,
"You got a problem with cartoons?"
This film proves that animated films can be on the same pecking order as live action ones, and that does work in some benefits where you can get away with certain things that you wouldn't be able to in those live action movies. One of them being Kingpin. I can't really take him too seriously with his character design when he comes on screen. However, that grin can be washed off my face immediately with some of the things he does in this film. Another thing I like a lot about this film is Miles Morales doesn't really become Spider-Man until the final battle. It's a film filled with emotion, deep themes and messages, and just a good origin story where we don't have our character feeling like he's who he's meant to be and can't do the things that others can, but once you find your purpose, you'll master it. This film oozes energy, is extremely stylish, is beautiful to watch, and has a great story, but it is unlucky to miss out on our top 2. When someone says classic superhero movies, my mind instantly goes to Spider-Man 2. As already talked about in this list, Spider-Man 2002 really revolutionized the comic book genre amongst X-Men and Blade. However, it still had a few campy elements. Spider-Man 2 brings in a stronger story and eliminates those campy elements, and therefore naturally makes a better film. To sum it up, it brings back everything good from the previous film and may so even improve it, but it also deletes the bad stuff. And overall, this pays off to deliver a more realistic movie. It focuses more time on Peter Parker rather than Spider-Man, but we're never in a scenario where we feel like, oh, can we just get Spider-Man back on screen? Because Peter Parker's personal life and struggles is just as interesting. This film is just very popular and presents so many iconic moments which are part of modern day mainstream culture. I mentioned the improvements this film made upon the other, but on rewatch I was really surprised to see how funny it was. There were moments where I literally cracked up because they're just so silly in terms of humor, not in terms of realism. It's got a real sense of style to it, and that little bit of humor which doesn't oversaturate it, just those small amounts, it really does have me laughing, and it tops off a film which is one of the best the genre has ever seen. This was one of the most anticipated films of all time, certainly for me personally as well. While I'm not going to cover any spoilers, I'll be as brief as possible. It meets those expectations and in some occasions may even go that bit further. No Way Home is really a film of two halves in the sense that the first half deals with the consequences of Peter's identity being revealed, and the second half is, well, dealing with the consequences of Peter trying to act upon Mysterio's consequences, and brings in some of the best fan service you'll see in any film. And while in some occasions fan service doesn't really work, Endgame, I think, flawlessly executed it and had the right to do so. And on the other hand, Ghostbusters Afterlife, which just came out, while it had the right to do so, it had to jump quite a few holes to get there. And don't even get me started on the Ghostbusters 2016, that was awful. Like Endgame, No Way Home has the right to do so. And while only talking about what's in the trailers, Spider-Man has been around for ages, long before the MCU was a thing, and it had its fans from back then who obviously are still fans today and are looking at Spider-Man in the MCU as like a new child after their old one with Tobey Maguire has grown up. So that appeals more to the mainstream who maybe aren't as intertwined with everything in the MCU. They just have to have that knowledge of they would have a blast with this film. And one of the biggest compliments I can give this film is I keep forgetting it's in the MCU. Yes, it has its ties, it has Doctor Strange, Happy Hogan, Stark technology. Like I said in Homecoming, you're always going to get that. It takes place in a cinematic universe, but they're really not relying on it here. I've drawn into so many aspects of nostalgia and love for the previous movies that I forgot that we're in a universe. And if anything, seeing these characters discuss things which have happened in the MCU really did put a smile on my face, so it kind of benefited from that. It executed both sides of the story really well and delivers an interesting new perspective into Peter Parker as we see him in perhaps his darkest state, and that goes past emo Peter. This is a much darker film in comparison to Homecoming and Far From Home. However, the lack of quirkiness doesn't dampen the quality, as it does come in when it's needed and it delivers. So overall, I think this film perfects everything it went for. Hence why it comes in at first place as my #1 Spider-Man movie. Who knows, maybe when I redo this ranking next year when Across the Spider-Verse Part 1 comes out, maybe my hype for it has died down a bit and I'll maybe have the rating a bit lower and even the movie a bit lower on the list. But as for now, Spider-Man No Way Home is my favourite Spider-Man movie. Thank you so much for watching. Spider-Man is my favourite superhero of all time, has been my entire life, so I really loved making this video, and even going back to rewatch the films, it gave me an excuse to do so. Please let me know in the comments what your ranking is, because there are a lot of different opinions on this franchise of film, and I'm eager to see what yours is. Whilst you're there, please like and subscribe, it really mean a lot. And if you want to check out my MCU ranking, it is my previous video, but I will leave a clickable card up in the corner here. You can literally see there, I've got something for Spider-Man, and I've got many other things, including all the DVDs, although 2 of them are currently lent out to people. I love talking about these. It makes me happy that you stuck around this long to listen to me. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video.